Friends, before I share our reading this morning, I just want to give you a heads up that my sermon this morning, which is about how we reckon with the religious and spiritual and ethical inheritance we receive from our families of origin and from our childhood. This sermon does include one story that involves sexual assault, and I just wanted to give you all a heads up about that. And to say that, when I offer these stories, they're always offered in prayers for our health and our wholeness. Our reading this morning is a brief passage from James Baldwin, which I've shared with some of you before. Baldwin was, of course, a great novelist and social critic, a critic of American racism. Many don't know that Baldwin grew up a child preacher in the Pentecostal holiness tradition, a place where he found a lot of affirmation as a kid, but that also, after he came out as gay, he felt also the condemnation of that tradition. And much of his writing is an effort to come to terms with that spiritual inheritance. In that spirit, then, I offer these brief words from James Baldwin. If the concept of God has any validity or use, it can only be to make us larger, freer, and more loving. If God cannot do this, then it's time we got rid of him. There ends our reading. More to come. Every family has a storyteller, or many families do. Does yours? A storyteller, the keeper of the family lore, the elder who at holidays and family gatherings draws people round to tell the stories of those who went before us, the stories of who we are. In my family, that person was my grandmother. When I was growing up, our family, like many, had its share of struggles. There were suicide attempts, both failed and successful, a terrible car accident, and a bitter custody battle that split our family in two. Just when it seemed that our family had forgotten how to love one another, my grandmother would tell stories, reminding us of when we did. One story she loved to tell was about her father, my great-grandfather, a man named Niccolo Collegiovanni. I come from an Italian family. We named our son Nico after him. Niccolo came to this country from southern Italy, right on the heel of the Italian boot. At Ellis Island, Niccolo Collegiovanni, like many immigrants eager to assimilate, changed his name to Nick Charles and moved to Rochester, New York, where he opened up a tailor shop. When the Great Depression hit, his business nearly collapsed, and he was forced to lay off all his employees, leaving only him and his siblings to work the shop. The story goes that one day during the Depression, a man entered Nick's shop. His clothes were tattered and grimy. He wasn't there to have them tailored. He asked my great-grandfather, "Could you spare some change? I need some money to buy food for my family." So Nick reached into his pocket and pulled out some coins and gave them to the man, who thanked him and left. When Nick turned back from the door, one of his sisters, my great-aunt Matilda, who managed the family finances with an iron fist, looked at him with a stare that could kill. She said, "Nick Charles, you can't afford to give that money away. You can barely support your own family." My great-grandfather turned to his formidable sister and shrugged his shoulders, and he said, "I know, Maddie, I know. But you never know when Il Signore will walk through your front door." My grandmother loved to tell that story. It always brought tears to her eyes. Later, when Alzheimer's disease began to ravage her mind, this was one of the 2 or 3 stories she still remembered. She'd always say, "Now stop me if I've told you this one before." But I always wanted to hear her tell it again. I've long since left the Catholic faith that nourished generations of my ancestors. Though I respect Catholicism, it simply wasn't a faith that could nourish me. But my forebears' faith and this story influence me to this day. I can trace my Unitarian belief in the inherent worth and dignity of every person back to this story and to my great-grandfather's belief that God's face, the face of Il Signore, shone through the face of others, not least the poor. To this day, this story helps me make sense of the people I come from, the vocation that I chose, and what I judge to be good and true about religion. Perhaps there are stories told in your family that shape your understanding of your people, yourself, and your faith. Or maybe there were experiences from your childhood that stand out to you as having influenced your faith to this day. This is a sermon about the stuff that gets passed down. As we begin the holiday season, many of us have or will spend time with our families of origin. I can see some of you gathered here this morning. For some, this gathering is a blessing. For others, let's face it, a struggle. For many of us, it's a little of both. For better or worse, the holiday season is an opportunity for us to take stock of the inheritance we've received from our families. Not money or property, not that kind of inheritance. This morning, I want to talk about the values our ancestors gave us, the faith or no faith they passed down to us, and how they modeled for us, or didn't, a life shaped by spiritual and ethical values. Now, sometimes people will say to me, "Wait, Rob, I didn't grow up in a religious household. This sermon isn't for me. I wasn't raised in any faith. I don't have a spiritual past to contend with." Well, let me say, I think we all have an intimate history with religion and spirituality. Even if we weren't raised in a religious community or family, we had ancestors who were, or close friends. Maybe we went to church or synagogue with a friend's family. We heard our parents talk about other people's religion. We noticed how their ethical values shaped their lives. If we didn't grow up in an explicitly religious household, our religious history might be a little harder to uncover, but it's there. And what I want to say this morning is that reckoning with our religious past is critical for our own spiritual wholeness and well-being. You know the old saying that those who are ignorant of history are doomed to repeat it. The same holds true for our own spiritual histories. If we don't seek to understand our religious past, if we don't examine both lovingly and critically the religious stories and experience that shaped us, then they can limit or diminish our spiritual lives in kind of unconscious and clandestine ways, subterranean. On the other hand, if we can have a healthy reckoning with our religious past, maybe leaving behind what we must, forgiving what we have to, and carrying forward what we can, then we free ourselves to embrace the fullness of our spiritual and ethical and religious lives. In her book, Proverbs of Ashes, the Unitarian theologian Rebecca Parker shares with her readers a painful story of how, as a young girl, she was repeatedly abused sexually by her family's next-door neighbor, a man named Frank. For many years, Parker repressed these memories, and only years later, with therapy, did she allow herself to recall the trauma. When she did, Parker went on to a successful career as a pastor and feminist theologian. Perhaps because of this experience, she dedicated her career to deconstructing a patriarchal God, God the Father, God the Lord and Master. Instead, she preached and wrote about a tender God, a God of mercy and love. But at one point in her career, she suffered a crisis of faith. After years of preaching and teaching about a merciful God, she writes, I had to face the fact that at the core of my being, I did not actually believe that such a God existed. I only believed in Frank. He still occupied the place of God in my life. It was his presence, his will, his actions that still ruled my life. I had no other God before him. In my own counseling, I often work with adults who believe they've moved on from the difficult religious experiences and stories from their childhood, but who only later discovered that though intellectually they've moved on, spiritually and emotionally they haven't yet. That in fact, they are still worshiping or fighting with the God of their childhood imagination. A God, perhaps, for whom they were never good enough, who made them feel less than or ashamed. A God made in the image of an angry father or an unforgiving mother. Friends, if we don't uncover and reckon with our religious past, we can spend our whole lives worshiping gods we no longer believe in. Later, Rebecca Parker moved to Berkeley, California to become president of the Unitarian Seminary there. When she shared her spiritual crisis with a friend from Berkeley, the friend listened kindly and carefully to Rebecca's confession that Frank was still God. Then her friend said to her, Rebecca, if your current God isn't working for you, this is California. You can get another God. Behind her friend's humor lies an important truth. We are free. We can be free to worship the God or no God, to choose the God or no God that we worship, to choose which God or no God we'll give our hearts to. But we can only freely choose our spiritual future when we understand and have honestly reckoned with our past. It's like James Baldwin said, if the concept of God has any validity or use, it can only be to make us larger, freer, and more loving. If God cannot do this, then it's time we got rid of him. And I would add, it's time we found another, right? Found another path forward, whether it involves God or not. I want to share one more story, a story perhaps about what this reckoning might look like in our lives, a story of one who's done some of this reckoning. It's the story of a woman named Helene. Helene is an artist who grew up in a strict Orthodox Jewish family. Much of her art deals with her relationship with Judaism. When Helene was 29 years old, her young husband was diagnosed with terminal cancer. During his final days, Helene got her period. In Orthodox Judaism, there's a law called nidah, the law of separation, which says that when a woman is menstruating, she and her husband must not have any intimate or physical contact for a minimum of 12 days, because the woman is considered impure, according to the ritual purity laws set out in Leviticus. Helene and her husband were convinced that it was God's commandment that they not touch as he lay dying. So they didn't. Years later, she still struggles to forgive the God who forbade her from holding her husband in his final days. Now, I'm sure hearing this story, none of us here would blame Helene if after an experience like that, she had chosen to leave orthodoxy behind, right? Incidents like these can damage a person's relationship to God and to their faith for the rest of their lives. But Helene didn't leave. She stayed, because there were parts of Orthodox Judaism that she still loved and cherished. Helene's 90-year-old mother, for instance, herself devoutly Orthodox, exemplified for Helene the beauty that could come from Jewish law. She exemplified that in the way that she makes sumptuous holiday meals for the family according to the laws of kosher, or how she creates beautiful Shabbat rituals faithful to the Sabbath laws set out in Torah. Her mother took the laws and strictures of orthodoxy and used them as they were intended, to remind Jews that every part of life, every act we take is beautiful and a blessing and is sacred. Today, Helene uses her art to work through her complex relationship to Judaism and to God. In exploring that relationship, she's been able to tease out the good from the bad, the blessing from the baggage. She's learned to leave the latter behind and take the gifts with her as she moves forward in her own spiritual life. I want to offer Helene's example as a model for all of us, for how we too might reckon with our religious past. Perhaps we too can lift up the blessings of that inheritance and reckon with the pain and forgive what must be forgiven. And from that reckoning, make our own work of art. Make of it something beautiful. So as you leave the meeting house this morning, I invite you to think back on the early experiences that shaped your understandings of faith, spirituality, and ethical life. Take note of them. Share them with others. How did they shape you? What legacy have they left you? And perhaps during this holiday season, you can also ask one of the elders in your family, one of the storytellers, to share a story of the faith that shaped your people. Or you, the elder, can share one of those stories with a younger generation. For the hurt and pain that sometimes gets passed down, we ask mercy and forgiveness. For the blessing that flows from generation to generation, we give our thanks and praise. Amen.